we will see you in just a minute. So we're really thrilled that you can join us today for our advocacy primer. And we're going to get started here in just a minute. Also hope that everybody's had a good start to the new year, that 2022 is treating you right, and that you've had also the start of a really great week. And it's been wonderful because I'm seeing attendees starting to come into the room. So welcome to our attendees. We're really thrilled to have you here today. And we're just gonna hold on starting, officially starting until we have more people are able to enter the room. So, and welcome. Happy New Year to everyone that's coming into the room right now. We're really thrilled that we're able to gather with you today. So if you're just joining us, welcome. You are at the Advocacy Primer, our town hall, first town hall of the 2022 year in the town hall season. So we're really thrilled to have you here today. And as folks are joining us, we just hope that your new year has started off in a really wonderful way. We're hoping that this week, it's your first week back to work. Welcome back. If you've been able to prolong the holiday, good for you, and we hope that it's going well. And but thanks again for taking time today to join us for this advocacy primer and for this very important conversation. So we're going to hold for about 1 more minute just to allow more people to come into the room. Got a nice start to our attendees for today. We're just thrilled that you're here. And we appreciate you joining us over your lunch hour. This is terrific. Great, okay, so it looks like we've got folks in the room right now, and we're just gonna go ahead and get started. We think that there are going to be some other folks that are going to join us today, so we'll just welcome them as they come in. So officially starting now. So welcome to the new year and to our lunchtime advocacy primer session. And I'm Kathleen Spihar, the Executive Director of COCA, the Council on Culture and Arts. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us for this conversation. Joining me are co-hosts Amber Tynan, Executive Director, and LaShawn Gordon, Director of Strategic Initiatives, both of the United Partners in Human Services, and Kathy Bai, Interim Executive Director of the Institute of Nonprofit Innovation and Excellence, INIE. As we begin 2022 and the needs continue to fluctuate in many portions of our sector, we continue to harness the value and power of cross-sector collaborations. So today's session is about advocacy. We'll ensure that you are equipped with the sector updates and advocacy tips you need for session 2022. This is what you need to know today. This public event is being recorded and streamed on Facebook Live. Social media will be monitored by COCA staff, and we will do our best to provide an answer to every question that is asked. At any time, if you wish to share your question in the chat or in the Q&A box at the very bottom of your screen, please do. And now I'm going to turn this over to LaShawn.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you all so very much for joining us. We are delighted to have Sabeen Perwaiz with us today for this exciting conversation. She is the president and CEO of the Florida Nonprofit Alliance, where she strengthens, promotes, and advocates on behalf of Florida's nonprofit sector. She's a staunch advocate for our sector. Some would say she's pretty fierce, and she and her team have been deeply immersed in making sure that the nonprofit sector stays front and center as new legislation is established to provide much needed support to our local communities. We've been blessed to, over the last 18 months, work directly with her and her team, and we're super excited to have her share more with you all today. So Sabeen, we're gonna turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, LaShawn, and thank you to Amber and the rest of the group putting this on today. As LaShawn mentioned, I'm here today with the Florida Nonprofit Alliance, really to give you an overview of what's happening on the state level, a quick update of what did not happen at the end of last year at the federal level, and what we have to look forward to, what comprised during the last special session that took place in November. And then most importantly, the research and data that we use to leverage the asks that we make, and hopefully the asks you have been making or will continue to make as we go down 2022. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. As LaShawn mentioned, the Florida Nonprofit Alliance mission is to serve as the state's collective voice, respected advocate, and effective connector and powerful mobilizer for the nonprofit sector. We are a member of the National Council of Nonprofits, so we represent the network here in Florida, across the nation, across with our other state associations, roughly 44 of them across the country. And that really comes in handy when there are other issues percolating in different states that can be opportunities for us, as well as challenges on bad ideas that get picked up by our state. And so we confer with one another on a weekly basis, and then have a regular monthly call as well. So the group is very, very connected with one another. We are a membership-based organization as well. We advocate on behalf of the state with the state agencies, the state regulators, the state legislature, as well as the representatives in DC. And if you just want to stay apprised of what's happening, you're welcome to subscribe to our newsletter. It goes out once a month and gives a quick overview of what took place in the state or federal level, any new research releases, and any other information that might be relevant for the sector. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. One of the things that's really important for us is to ensure that we have accurate data as we talk about the sector. And so over the course of COVID-19, one of the things that we've been doing are regular COVID-19 impact surveys, similar to the ones that INIE has done on the local level. This has been instrumental in discussing what's been taking place with our elected officials so that they have real life information and data on what's happening, as opposed to anecdotal evidence on what may or may not be happening. So we're going to start today's presentation with an overview of the release from this past month. We released it in December with roughly 1,500 organizations represented across the state. And as you can see, they were very representative of the distribution of nonprofits across the state as well. This is really important because it essentially showcases what the sector is enduring, what the sector has overcome or not overcome. And so as elected officials are looking at information around, well, nonprofits are always fundraising, this is really important to share as far as how the data around fundraising looks, how data around employment looks, how data around PPP budgets versus no PPP budgets looks, so that as they're looking and hearing from you all, they know that there is a great discrepancy across the sector as far as fundraising is concerned. Last year, we also released our individual giving survey, and that also showed that individual donors are down. Individual giving has declined in all but 10 counties across the state of Florida. And only 2 counties, Palm Beach and Collier, are the ones that are essentially carrying the state. So if giving is down, if PPP is down and gone, then what does that mean as we look at the overview of the sector? So let's get started with the key findings. We broke it down with the bright side and the challenging side. We know nonprofits are really resilient and committed to the services and programs they provide in their communities. Program operations was a big challenge for nonprofits in 2020, but nonprofits are feeling more confident and less challenged in program delivery this year being 2021. And it's probably not surprising to anyone in the sector that nonprofits have prioritized providing services, including getting back to person. Just over half of the responding organizations expected their budget to increase in 2022. And the vast majority of organizations are not concerned about staying in existence or merging with another organization, showing at the very least optimism at the future. Just over a quarter of organizations know that they can continue to operate for more than 2 years, which is up from our last survey in 2021 by 18%. Nonprofits also told us that they continue to rely on collaborations or partnerships similar to the one like today, now maybe more than ever. They're very interested in how to successfully maintain those in the post-pandemic world. So now we'll look at some challenging news. Nonprofits are not recovering quickly financially, and fundraising and funding remain both the largest concern and a challenge for nonprofits. 53% had a decrease in unrestricted revenue, 48% have budgets that shrunk. Although COVID-19 relief funding was vital to 80% of nonprofit organizations making it through the pandemic, those sources are largely no longer available. 49% of nonprofit organizations have spent more or all of their reserves, making them more financially fragile than before the pandemic. Half of nonprofits generated less income from fundraising in 2021 than they did in 2020, building upon the 69% that had a drop in their fundraising. And then finally, new sources for funding did not materialize in the way that nonprofits had hoped they would. Continuing with the challenging news, at the same time, 38% of nonprofits are seeing an increase in demand for services, and 36% have served more people this year than last. 30% of nonprofits say they served more people this year than in 2019, which was pre-COVID-19. One of the biggest impacts we've seen from the COVID-19 pandemic is a negative effect on volunteering. When volunteering is down, nonprofits are burdened with extra costs, extra burden on already taxed staff, or both. 44% of nonprofits have experienced volunteer absences, and half of nonprofits are using fewer volunteers now than they did in 2019. And 55% of organizations have altered their volunteering opportunities. So let's dive a little bit deeper into this data. And while doing so, I want to highlight why research like this is extremely critical to discuss with elected officials as we are making the case of why they should support the sector. And we'll do that with ARPA funding specifically right after this piece. 43% of organizations are allowing changing work arrangements for both staff and organization volunteers, a significant percentage, but one that did drop slightly from 48% in December. 44% of organizations report still experiencing this in 2021, although that number has dropped from 52%. Now, this is something that's happening across the country in all sectors as well. The nonprofit sector in Florida is not immune to the national trend of the Great Resignation. Employees are quitting their jobs and not looking for new ones. 19% of organizations have experienced a staff turnover and resignations. And some respondents specifically mentioned they have trouble filling current vacancies with qualified individuals. In addition, 18% of organizations report staff absences, which is an increase from last year. And when we look at this in comparison with last year being 2020, 43% of organizations are allowing changing work arrangements as well. And so what does that really look like for individuals? When you currently have board members also looking at, just burnout from being really importantly immersed into this work and not knowing when it's going to end. So you can see that volunteers have decreased compared to 2019 numbers, and individuals are seeing changes in not just their employee structure, but also their volunteers and board member structure. So this is really important as we're looking at raising dollars from elected officials, specifically when it comes to any legislation that's filed. You all in Leon County were successful in getting some dollars allocated for the state for the nonprofit sector, and INIE was instrumental in sharing that information. On the state and national level, that work is being done leveraging what's been taking place across the country as well. So as I mentioned, the National Council Network, we've been looking at ARPA examples, the American Rescue Act fund examples, from across the country, from blue states, red states, purple states, to really highlight successful models of what's working and what has been able to help the sector. What's critical for that, and what we would say in any advocacy one-on-one training, is that it's important to connect the dots with the language that's currently being used. And so for us, when we're talking about why it's important for nonprofits to have the dollars that they need, it's because of the work that they're doing to strengthen their communities, to recover their communities, which is what are the buzzwords that are currently being used, not just in our state legislature, but in a lot of our local municipalities and a lot of our local counties, as well as on the federal level. And so if we're looking at serving a lot more clients because of COVID-19, then have depleted resources, but have increased demand on our programming and our staff, then something has to give in order for us to meet that gap with fundraising. And it's really important for that, because one thing we hear time and time again from elected officials are nonprofits are always fundraising. So how do we actually know that this is a dire need? And so the dire need part comes with research and data to show the impact of your work. so that you can talk about why it's important for them to fund the work, because you're essentially helping the communities that they serve and are funding a gap that exists within that local community. So I think not surprising to most of you on this call, nonprofits generated less income from fundraising in 2021 than they did in 2020, which just builds upon the 69% that had a drop in fundraising altogether. This chart really goes and looks at the data that we had from 2019 and then the 2020 predictions. So the change is what we're really looking at. Although nonprofit organizations plan to expand their funding sources with new ones in 2021, that did not transpire. Comparing their plan of expectations for 2021, nonprofits did not receive new funding from any source listed in the question. That means nonprofits are relying more heavily on existing sources of funds rather than new ones. The average number of funding sources per respondent was 3. And this is important because we know, and we have data and research to back this up, that individual giving is declining. So the average middle-class donor has decreased significantly. And then you only have the usual suspect donors, and then the current relationships that you have with your existing foundations or corporate giving grants. Many of them stepped up in the 2020, 2021 during the pandemic to give grants or continue unrestricted grants to organizations that were funding. But for new funding sources or for organizations that were trying to establish new relationships, that was extremely difficult to do. And so for those small organizations, especially BIPOC-led organizations, it's really been a tremendously challenging experience in the fundraising realm. And the ones that we're hoping when we're looking at state and local funding, that there's a separate pool created just for those organizations, because they're usually not in the vetted pool of applicants. And Winter Park is a great example of this. When they were giving out their ARPA funds, they had a setup fund, just like you all did in Leon, for organizations that had existing relationships or were part of the United Way network. But in addition to those organizations, they did a search specifically for organizations that were under a budget size of 100,000 and or were led by BIPOC members of the community, because these were usually the small grassroots-led nonprofit that were doing the work, but are not in the usual nonprofit funding pools. And so they were receiving a separate funding pool in order to ensure that they had ability to access their ARPA funds. So as we're looking at the legislative session and what that means, some of the things that are the key takeaways for us from this work are: 1, transparency in government spending. And we'll talk about this a little bit in one of the bills that was filed for this upcoming session. We know we're going to see additional fallout from the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence investigations, and this is as a result of that. State budgets continue to look positive and should be record high. However, there is a likelihood that it will largely be spent on one-time hard infrastructure projects and not soft projects. One of the things that we've been doing here at FNA is working with our local partners. And so whether it's community foundations, whether it's managing support organizations like INIE across the state, to really empower them to have the tools and resources they need to better advocate for ARPA funds for nonprofits locally. We know that the chances of that happening are very, very slim to none on the state level. Although one opportunity here is the Florida Council of 100. This is the organization with the largest 100 businesses within Florida. They, for the first time in their history, put the nonprofit sector as a priority as part of their 8 recommended plans of funding. And we were one of the 8. What that means is, they had 2 buckets. They had strengthening community bucket and recovering communities bucket. And they felt like it was extremely important to fund the nonprofit sector in order to help recovering communities do better. And so it was really great to see that effort on their part, and to leverage that as we're talking to state leadership, and to ensure that they continue to hear from us. But the chances of something happening on the state level are still slim. And then finally, of course, I'm sure you all know that the session is coming up on January 11th and will conclude on March 11th. So when we look at finance and funding, one of the things that's really important is really looking at opportunities to include growing individual giving, but also needs to include the corporate community foundations and government as well. This is really important because the PPP carried the sector in both 2021 and 2020. With no PPP this year, it will be an extremely telling year as far as organizational budgets, organizational capacity, and ability to withstand, especially for those that were utilizing their reserves or have completely utilized their reserves. So this is really important to include as you're talking to elected officials at any level, whether it's local, state, or federal, because it's important to notate, a good year doesn't necessarily mean that that will carry over in this year because that funding is not there anymore. Now we're looking at human resources. So this is another piece that's really important to mention because the greatest challenges for nonprofits are adapting to uncertainty and keeping people safe and healthy. And so one of the things that's really important is making sure that up-to-date information on the virus, best practices, sharing across industries, staff and leadership are really there. So one, your team feels safe and protected. Two, that you're speaking with your counterparts in other industries as well, so that the sector is included in that conversation. A great example of this is the Associated Industries of Task Force had their calls last year and the year before. We were included as part of the nonprofit sector for the first time in these discussions. Why? Because the first time when they were looking at how do we reopen, well, the nonprofit sector didn't close. We had to pivot and figure out how to help our clients, but we were all still working to commit to making sure we were helping fulfill our missions. And so we were invited to include that information, to share that information. We created a reopening guide. And so it's really important. Advocacy doesn't necessarily just include elected officials. It also includes the business community, government, to ensure you're part of those discussions, to ensure that you're part of the conversations as things arise in our local communities, because otherwise the sector is given the information or passed down, but it's not included in figuring out how to implement best practices. So it's really important to be part of those conversations as well. And then, of course, volunteering. Volunteering will be critical moving forward because we just, with new variants popping up and Omicron now being part of the surge, we just don't know the safest way to incorporate volunteers back into the workplace. And every organization is doing that the best they can with the abilities that they have with them. Some organizations have gotten creative with this as far as funding partners because they're working with their local hospital systems or medical facilities and making sure that they're able to subsidize some of the added costs that come with safely introducing volunteers into the space, whether that be testing, whether that be PPE equipment, whether that be utilizing safety plans that the hospital systems have created and really making sure that best practices are implemented and introduced as opposed to starting from scratch. Why recreate the wheel? So now we're going to talk a little bit about the special session that took place in November. This might be already something you're all familiar with, so we'll just go through this really quickly. Essentially, this prohibits vaccine mandates by private employers and by requiring employers to offer exemptions for medical reasons such as pregnancy, planned pregnancy, religious reasons, or immunity due to a previous COVID-19 illness. Additionally, employees can choose to participate in periodic testing or use personal protective equipment at the cost of the employer. This also imposes fines for employers who wrongly terminate employees due to vaccine mandates. What's important here is that, as a private entity, you all should consult with your legal counsel to ensure that you're in compliance with this piece as it relates to the state. It also put rules in for school districts, but that doesn't necessarily apply here, but just information and slides in case you need it. And what's really important here that is the Florida judge, a federal judge did deny a motion citing that Florida has not proved irreparable harm to its workforce for a suit that was followed by Attorney General Moody. What's changed now since the last 2 weeks is on December 22, OSHA did include an emergency temporary standard. And so for this, employers have to show good will to ensure that they're including a space for COVID-19 vaccination and testing standards. And so for OSHA, and you can read this in detail again, citing your legal team, but employers must provide sufficient time to come with compliance. OSHA will not issue citations for non-compliance with any requirements of the ETS before January 10th, and will not issue citations for non-compliance with the standards testing before February 9th. so long as the employer is exercising reasonable good faith efforts to come into compliance with the standard. And so this is really important for us in Florida because it's a little bit directly in conflict with the special session legislation. And so I'm sure your legal team has already talked to you about it. If not, I would highly encourage you to do so because the fines will start as of February. And then lastly, the Sixth Circuit decision is being appealed, and there are other cases as well. And so if you're curious as to the breakdown or the moving parts in this, I've linked 2 articles from 2 legal firms that are reputable across the country, and they really go into a deeper dive on this issue. Now for the legislative session, this is the one bill that's so far filed that directly affects nonprofits. This is directly as a result of the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and it's essentially asking for audits, and it's looking at 3 budget sizes, 250,000, 500, and over $1 million. And it would require audits for any agency that's receiving funding from the state. This is a bill that was filed last year. It did not pass. We have reached out to that office last year to make sure that they utilize operational tools like 990s and information that's already publicly available about the said nonprofit, as opposed to adding and imposing more work and more costs to the nonprofit, especially for those under 500,000. An audit is not a cheap undertaking. And so we are going to be working with Representative Parsons and Malika to ensure that they know what's available and are making sure that the rules and standards for DCF have been changed as a result of Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So something like that cannot happen again, but that doesn't mean we have to punish the entire sector, because this is going to add a lot more work for those that receive funds from the state. And then lastly, I mentioned a lot of research reports and tools that are available. Just adding those here, and you can search them on the website if you're interested at all. Economic impact data is available by region and by county. COVID-19 research from all of the years that we've done is there, as well as the individual giving research that we released last year. And then our latest one will be coming with the Lilly School of Philanthropy in March of this year. The Reopening Re-Engagement Guide, COVID Guide, and then ARPA Funding Guide. So with that, I will turn it over to the team for questions.
Now I'm unmuted. Okay, it's been amazing. That's a tremendous amount of information that you've provided for us, and so a lot here to unpack. If you, for all the audiences that are listening, if you've got a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A or use the chat and we can try to answer your question. Also, if you're streaming live on Facebook, please feel free to pop a question on Facebook, and we're also monitoring that. So with all this information that you've given us, there's the topics you talked about just recently, the legislation that we need to be aware of as far as the audits. Are there any other topics in session 2022 that nonprofits also need to be aware of, especially in relation to the talking points that you mentioned in regards to the nonprofits being, the service to the community, and also the challenges of the donor donations being down, but yet the services are up. How does that align? Some of those talking points, how does that align with some of the topics that you're seeing in session, and how can we advocate? Can we use those to advocate better for ourselves?
For session, it's really hard because most of the bills have been filed or will be filed within this last remaining few days that are left. What is helpful is making sure you're speaking to your local representative in Tallahassee and making sure that they're able to help you advocate on the local level. Why I say that is because ARPA funds weren't just given to the state. They were given to counties, they were given to municipalities, and they were given to large metros. So there are a lot of different funding pools available. Why it's helpful to talk to your elected officials, just in the general sense of how can we access these funds, it would be really nice and cite examples from other communities across the state around where this has been done really well, like Tampa, like Winter Park, like Gainesville, as to, here are in local jurisdictions that were able to create different funding pools for nonprofits. Elected officials have a lot of power in, local government. Indirectly, they can speak to the mayors, they can speak to the city council members, and really make sure that this conversation keeps coming up. So if the local elected should be hearing from you, but if they're also hearing from their state representative, if they're also hearing from the aide for that representative, they know that this is an important piece to have. On the state level, it certainly doesn't hurt to ask, and we are, like I said, going to be making those asks, but we've just been told that it's going to be slim because a lot of this is earmarked for infrastructure. That doesn't mean there's always last minute things happen the last 2 days of session. That doesn't mean things won't change, but that's essentially where we are. In addition, advocating also means using this to advocate with funders. Funders aren't aware around a lot of these issues either. And so the research shouldn't be shared with the ask. The research should be shared with a did you know, let's have a conversation, or just thought you'd like to see this, because you don't know which direction it will go with any said individual. And so that's what we're hoping for and working with on the state level, but we would really encourage individuals to do that on their local levels as well.
We do have a couple of questions in the chat. One of them was about the rules applying to the volunteers. I think that was for like the vaccination and stuff. And then the other one was,
vaccination piece is just for employers.
Okay. And then the other one was about if the audit bill passes, what would that mean for nonprofits with budgets under 50,000 or 100?
Yeah, so currently the bill would not apply for those two tiers. It's minimum is 150 and 300,000 and 500,000. And so what that means is for those that have a budget of 150 or more, they would be required to have audits every 3 years. For 300,000 is 5 years, and then 500,000 for 7 years. And I can link the bill text if helpful for those that want to review it. The chances of this bill getting passed are not very high. Like I mentioned, this was introduced last year. The text is pretty similar to last year, but the representative is very keen on making sure that entities are held accountable. And so this is part of her talking points and something that she pushed to her voters. And so she wants to make sure that she sticks to that. But we will see if this happens, and we will be working with her and pushing this to ensure that it's fair. And so what the language looks like right now does not mean this is a language that's going to pass. So the link that I shared, you can track the bill there. You can see if it moves in its committees. But this was something that was introduced last year and did not come close to passing.
Thank you so much for those updates. Over to you, LaShawn.
So we do have another question. So we know that the work of nonprofit organizations made just a huge, huge impact in helping to support and sustain our communities. Talk to us a little bit about how can we strengthen that message during session?
Yeah, so I think for session, it's important to remember a few things. If you're just doing a visit just to make sure you're talking about your organization and the work that's done, then like I said, I would connect it back to the two things that are being touted from the rooftops: strengthening communities and recovering communities. So how is your work helping recovering communities? For example, for someone that's taking care of the hunger need, if work is down, if people are still unemployed, if costs have increased, if there's a shortage and food banks are making that difference, then you are helping communities recover through that. You have to fit your mission into the buzzwords that they're using, so it's not siloed by itself, because everything that's being funded by these elected officials is seen as important. It's not that this is not important, but if it fits in, if it decreases a gap that exists, if it's adding to work that already is committed and going on, then you're part of a system that's working really well, and you're not going to be disrupting it with your introduction of a new bill, et cetera. And so it's really making sure you know the pieces of the cogs so that you can show how your work is part of that system. And that just resonates really well with elected officials. A great example that I give all the time is Pace Center for Girls. They've been able to quantify how their work saves taxpayer dollars and saves our state money. And so they're able to say, for every girl we serve in our program, we save the taxpayer $44,000 a year. That's one girl per, one PACE jurisdiction locally. And that's a powerful number to have when you times that by all the girls that they have per year in different offices. They have 19 offices in Florida. So figuring out that number for you and the impact that you're making locally and connecting it back to the messages that your elected officials are utilizing is key to it resonating with them.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions, but do we have any questions in the chat? I don't see any. So I'll move to the next question. And as things are coming up for you all, feel free to put them in the chat. Those of you in Facebook land, you can also post your questions as well. So with the combination of surplus from fiscal year 2021, the American Rescue Plan stimulus, would nonprofits be well poised to request resources to continue funding the increased service demands elevated by the pandemic?
When it comes to ARPA, absolutely. ARPA is this unique element that's been introduced into our lives because there's just so many different pools that have been created. So it's not just at any one level, it's at all levels. One thing that I've seen really well, done really well by individual nonprofits, is some are able to leverage and access ARPA funds through the proposals that they put forward in local communities. And so there are great resources available, and I can send that afterwards to Amber or any specific individual, just you all let me know, where you can track to see what your local city has submitted as part of their ARPA funds. So ARPA funds, you have to have designated by the end of 2023, and then the funds will be, have to be utilized by the end of 24, 25, 26, depending on what cycle you were part of. And so what's interesting there is you can see with the plan of action the city has committed to and submitted, but then they have to go back and actually find providers to help them complete those plans. And so this is where I've seen nonprofits get very creative in making sure that they are able to access the work that the city has already said they're going to do, whether it be for education or after school services or childcare. And they say, we can really help you with this. You give us the RFP for this work, and they've been able to do that. And so it's on us to do the work to find those pieces and then make sure that we can do that. This is on the individual level. Now, other communities have created funds specifically for nonprofits, but all the communities in Florida have not done that. And so you can go the individual route, or you can band together and go after it on the county route, et cetera. Like I said, Leon County has already done that. So for you all, I'm sure that's already been done and awarded, or they've given out the timeline of when that will be awarded. So the next piece would be on the individual route. In addition, I'm happy to share there's ARPA, resources as far as letters, toolkits. So if anybody comes back and says, well, this can't be used for this purpose, it has to be used on infrastructure, that's completely inaccurate. And so if they want that, information on the actual legislation or the specific language used in the legislation to be able to access those funds, we're happy to provide that resource to you as well.
So before we kind of get some final thoughts from Sabeen, and Kathleen is going to pop in here in a moment as well, do we have any more questions?
I do have one question. If we don't have any questions right now, I'm not seeing any in the Q&A or the chat. And that is, Sabeen, you talked about infrastructure, and one of the national conversations has been about infrastructure, not just as, bricks and mortar, but also infrastructure as in investing in people, investing in staff and buildings. So are you getting, from what you've seen, is that going to be part of the state infrastructure package, or could that be part of the state infrastructure package in regards to state infrastructure is about building our organizations in addition to the buildings that people are in? So could you just give us some insights on that?
Yeah, and as much as I would love to say yes, unfortunately, no. We as a state are really taking infrastructure for what comes to, first in mind: road, bandwidth, water, sewage. I mean, a lot of our actual infrastructure is in pretty outdated conditions. So they're taking that literally and working on that. And so unfortunately, I just don't see that coming out of our state at this moment in time. What I will say is what was exciting with the Build Back Better on the federal level, which did not pass at the end of last year and is now going to be resuming talks in the Senate sometime coming up this month. There were pieces included in there for, some of what you alluded to for families and individuals, things that are now expired that affect the nonprofit sector that may come back should that conversation pick up and actually pass. It didn't pass because of one vote. Child tax credit. So that has now been gone, that has expired. Earned income tax credit, universal charitable deduction. And that's something we worked with our national team to pass for the sector. 100% AGI cap on individual deductions, 25% AGI cap on corporate deductions, and employee retention tax credit. These were all things that we fought really hard for to continue, and unfortunately they have expired. But should the Build Back Better be introduced again for conversation in the Senate and compromises be made, those were things that would really provide support for the nonprofit sector, and we're going to be tracking that as well.
That's really fantastic. Thank you. I'm looking at the chat and wondering if there's any other questions that folks have on their minds, also with the Q&A. So I'm not seeing anything off the top of my head. One other, since we've got a little time, one other thing that I wanted to talk to you about, Sabeen, is that you had mentioned three particular initiatives, Tampa and Winter Park and Gainesville. And especially since Leon County already has our fantastic, that ARPA program that came through and nonprofits have benefited from that and so on, yet this is, the needs are going to continue on. Was there anything in those three programs that you thought was either really unique or something that we might be able to riff off of as we look at still the continuing need for resources coming up in the next, especially in the next year or two?
Yeah, and so all three were unique in their own right. For Winter Park, I will say it was specifically their focus on small grassroots in addition to regular human service nonprofits. And so they really looked at a list and took time and effort to create a list of nonprofits led by BIPOC members of the community working specifically locally in grassroots communities. And that's the first time that I've seen that done in our state. So they had a funding pool for traditional nonprofits, and then they had a smaller, distinct funding pool for those entities. And their model is now being implemented in 2 other states. So that's really exciting to see that they were able to do that. The second is Gainesville. Sorry, I said Gainesville. Gainesville was starting right at the end of last year. The second would be Ocala, because they were able to do it for county and the city for nonprofits. And the way they were able to do that with their community foundation was, one, they asked Laura, who has the community foundation, for numbers. So how has COVID-19 affected the nonprofit sector? And they asked her to update those numbers essentially every 3 to 4 months, which is a lot of work, but they really wanted to make sure that she was committed to this work and that she had data to back why this effort was necessary. And so she was able to utilize the numbers from our research, as well as the quick survey she did locally for her research to show, here's the trends in the state, here's the trends here locally, this is why this funding is important. And she was able to leverage the individual giving data. So that gave the commissioners enough backing to show this is necessary. This is not, again, just an ask just for the sake of asking. And they were able to leverage that for both the city funds and the county funds. In Tampa, what was unique was their community foundation has a specific program for nonprofit CEOs that they work with regularly. And so they have a representative from the nonprofit CEO that they kind of have conversations with if something new is coming up. Their mayor's office came to them directly and said, we are thinking about this funding pool. Can you navigate this? And can you tell us what the needs are? And so one, they were able to leverage the data asks, similar to what happened in Ocala. But 2, they were able to provide frontline information from CEOs because they had the CEO group ready to go and ask them, if you had one item that would be really helpful, what is it? So they created a needs list. A lot of nonprofits have that needs list of you can take away this wish list item, et cetera. So they created that for nonprofits in their community. And that allowed not just their, this new funding pool to address it, but also their donors. So it was a really quick effort to hear, okay, I would like to help this nonprofit that could just really use help with this. And in return, they would have this impact on their community. So each had a unique flavor that was representative of their community, but the connectivity with data alongside with connectivity with their local nonprofits was key in ensuring that they were the right partner to disseminate those funds, and they were a trusted partner. So that's really important. This does not develop overnight. They have to know you. They have to know that you can do the work. In Tampa's instance, that community foundation essentially had to give out the funds first and then get reimbursed. Not everybody can do that. And, so there's different logistics to keep in mind as well, but each had its own flavor to it. And it's really exciting because we convene this group regularly and they all talk to each other as well. And so if they want to learn from one another, they can as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I know we do have another question that has come up in the chat. Ben Gunther, I'm just going to go ahead and read it. I'm encouraged to hear that one effect of the pandemic has been to promote commitment to collaboration amongst nonprofits. Are there structures in place to facilitate collaborations across subsectors, for example, between arts organizations and human services organizations?
I would defer to INIE on that as far as what's happening locally. I can certainly share examples of what we've seen. I live in Jacksonville, and so here the Nonprofit Center of Northeast Florida has been really keen on, whenever they have their CEO conversations once a month, to leverage shared resources, whether it's a shared staff for something like accounting or HR, so that one organization is not carrying the load, especially in these times where we're working remotely, et cetera. So there's been a lot of creativity that's come across from those candid discussions that happen in those CEOs only conversations. And so, but I would defer to INIE and if they have anything to add there specifically for that question.
Okay, that's really fantastic. So if Kathy, if you are available and you'd like to unmute and go ahead and share now, that's terrific. We know that you've got multiple events going on right now, so we know that we can also catch that information later on and send that out to this group. So we have, I believe, another comment in the chat. So this is for, let's see. So Amber had just confirmed that we have a cohort on COCA, INIE, and UPHS who are basically the sponsors of today's event. And we've been really working together to create that kind of synergy. And we, the trio has really helped the advocacy that you have seen. And so, we're continuing to look at ways and building that up too. So we certainly welcome, especially from today's conversation and from the folks that are attending today, if other ideas pop up, or if there's other collaborative ways that you think that the three of us could also work together within the sector that we're not aware of, please, reach out. Ideas building on top of ideas, advocacy building on top of advocacy gets us into the places where we've got the kind of resources and the kind of also coalitions built, as Sabeen has been talking about, that really will make this kind of put more punch into our advocacy. So, LaShawn, do you see any other questions, or do you have anything else that you want to share today?
I think we're good. Just highlighting the point, and you touched on it, Amber talked about it, having the synergy among the three organizations is super, super important all across the sector. So with that being said, Sabeen, this has been a really, really enlightening conversation, lots of positive feedback in the chat. And so we just want to thank you for joining us today, sharing your wisdom with us, equipping us with more tools, as session gets ready to start and we continue with the advocacy journey. Before I kick it over to Kathleen to kind of close us out and to give some more information, are there any thoughts or anything that you'd like to share?
No, I just want to thank you all for including Florida Nonprofit Alliance in this conversation. And, to the point that Kathleen was making earlier, collaboration across sectors and across different organizations is critical. We embody that as well. We work closely with Florida Philanthropic Network, which is a membership organization of the philanthropic side of our state. We work closely with the Florida Chamber Foundation to ensure that the nonprofit sector is part of the work that they're doing, and we're able to add individual giving as a tracker on their dashboard the end of last year, which is really important so that as we're looking at growing as a state and 1,000 new people are coming in, we want to make sure they contribute to the sector as well and get connected with their community. And so we're just really excited to work with our partners, and we're really excited for this upcoming session. And for all of you that are engaging in advocacy, thank you. Most nonprofits are shying away from it or are afraid to do it, and it's nothing scary, but it's just really important. You're essentially ambassadors and cheerleaders for the work that you do, and so I hope more of you do it. And if you have any questions, please ask.
Thank you.
There's a question about any more events or online forums planned during this year's session.
I think this is for Sabeen.
Yes,
So,
it is. Sorry.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yes, sorry, I had muted myself. Yes, thank you, Alice Lee, for that question. We do have a state of the sector coming up. I believe it's next week, January 11th, I want to say. You can find it on our website, and that's essentially where we'll give the latest standing of the sector as we enter 2022. From the economic impact standpoint, we'll be sharing that with the state leadership as well, so they're aware of the power of the sector, so that again, the funding that comes to the sector isn't just going off into this, deep end. It's really contributing to Florida's economy. That's part of the necessary engine for the state to work. And then we also have our Giving in Florida release happening in March that will look at really how we as a state fare compared to national data points. And again, as I referenced, this will be with the Lilly School of Philanthropy, which we're really excited about to have this national scale research available for Florida. And then we have advocacy trainings on the website as well. And then Consultant Connection, which Alice Lee and some of the others on this call happen to be a part of, that really looks at how our consultant community can help the nonprofit sector thrive.
That's fantastic. And so thank you so much, Sabeen. There's access and resources. If you watch the chat, we're going to start, we're going to go ahead and start uploading them. So they're coming at you. If you want to save the chat in a couple of minutes, that's going to be a really good idea. We have them for the nonprofit report that the reports that Sabeen has been discussing. Also, COCA has an advocacy corner that you can go to specifically for arts, culture, history, and heritage, but also very applicable to others, because there is an advocacy tip sheet from the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies that is just a real simple one sheet. If you're going to go into a session and talk, here's some ways, some things that you need to make sure that you have in place before you go. The UPHS advocacy training guide is also available. And then we also, since we're huge on collaboration, we just constantly are asking you to please join Collaborate Big Ben Facebook page, because we want to share ideas there. And there's been such a load of rich ideas from today. So thank you again so much, Sabeen. This has just been such a fantastic session with you. And for everyone out there, a recording of this advocacy session will be available online by the end of the week. On Friday, we will also be emailing out that link to all participants here, along with all of these advocacy links. As our sector gets ready to advocate for a session later on this month, we really want to thank you so much again, Sabeen, for being our featured speaker, for sharing your expertise and your advocacy tools and tips, and beautifully addressing all these questions that we have. Session starts January 11th, and we're excited and ready. In the meantime, stay tuned for other town hall announcements this year. And as COVID is still with us, please don't forget, wear your mask, share vaccination information, and keep each other safe. Thanks, everybody. What a great way to start out 2022. Thank you. Take care of each other, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.